She was 19 years old and she had $10. That is the whole story, really. Everything else, the rotting hull, the rusted lock. The 40 years of silence packed into canvas bags that all came after. But the story begins with $10 and a girl standing at the edge of a dock in southern Louisiana at dusk, watching the light die over the cypress trees, holding a folded bill in each hand, and thinking that some decisions don't feel like decisions at all. They feel like gravity. They feel like the only direction left. May Calloway had been moving toward water her entire life without knowing it. She was born in Tupelo, Mississippi, in a house 3 blocks from the railroad tracks, in a town where the nearest river worth naming was 40 miles east, and the nearest ocean might as well have been on the moon. Tupelo was a landlocked place in every sense, geographically, emotionally, spiritually landlocked. The kind of town where the future arrived about 10 years late and left without saying much. The streets were flat and wide and mostly empty on Sunday afternoons, and the biggest body of water most people ever saw was the retention pond behind the Walmart on Highway 45. May drew boats. She had been drawing them since she was 4 years old, before she could read, before she understood what a boat actually did, or where it went, or what it meant to be on the water. She drew them in crayon on the backs of grocery store receipts and the margins of church bulletins, and once in blue marker across the entire surface of her bedroom door, which got her sent to her room for the rest of the afternoon. Though the door was never repainted, because her mother Lynette thought the drawing was actually quite good. Lynette Calloway was the kind of woman who understood that certain things in children were not misbehavior, but expression, and that the difference mattered. Lynette kept a manila folder in the kitchen drawer between the takeout menus and the utility bills. Every drawing May produced, and there were dozens, then hundreds, went into that folder. Crayon boats with crooked sails, marker boats with stick figure sailors, pencil sketches of tugboats and houseboats and sailboats with masts so tall they ran off the edge of the paper. By the time May was 9, the folder was nearly 2 inches thick, and Lynette had started a second one. She never said much about it. She would just take the drawing, look at it for a moment with the particular attention she gave to things she found genuinely interesting, and then slide it into the folder with the others. May never asked her why. She didn't need to. There was an understanding between them that didn't require language, the kind of understanding that exists between people who see the world the same way and know it without having to say so. When May was 11, Lynette was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. It was November, the year May was in 6th grade, the year she had just started wearing her hair in a single braid down her back, the way Lynette wore hers. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday. By the following March, Lynette was gone. 4 months and 11 days from the word cancer to the word burial, which is one of the cruelest things about that particular disease. It doesn't give you enough time to say everything you need to say, but it gives you just enough time to watch someone you love disappear piece by piece, becoming less of themselves each week, until the person in the hospital bed is someone you recognize only by the shape of their hands. May had memorized her mother's hands. She still thought about them years later, the way Lynette's fingers looked when she was reading or cooking or sliding a drawing into a manila folder. Careful hands, hands that knew the weight of things. Her father, Gary Calloway, did not have careful hands. Gary was an electrician at the county high school. A quiet man who had built his entire life around Lynette, without fully realizing it, the way a vine builds itself around a fence post, until the post is gone, and the vine has nothing left to hold it up, and begins to fall in whatever direction gravity suggests. After Lynette died, Gary fell slowly. Not dramatically. There was no single moment of collapse, no scene, no raised voices or broken furniture. He just began to recede. He came home from work. He made dinner or he didn't. He watched the news or he watched nothing, sitting in the recliner in the living room with the television off, and his hands loose in his lap, looking at a spot on the wall that contained nothing May could see. May learned to read the house by sound. The particular weight of Gary's footsteps on the kitchen linoleum told her whether he'd had 2 beers or 4. The duration of silence between the refrigerator opening and closing told her whether he was eating or just standing in front of it staring at the shelves. He never raised his voice. He never scared her. He was simply absent in a way that was somehow worse than anger, a man-shaped absence in the rooms where her parents used to be. She did not blame him exactly. She had the capacity to understand, even at 12, even at 14, that grief does things to people that the people themselves cannot control, and that Gary's disappearance was not a choice any more than Lynette's cancer had been a choice. Understanding did not make it less lonely. It just made it a different kind of lonely, the kind that comes with a side of guilt for being lonely in the first place, because the man was still there, technically still showing up and eating and sleeping, which is more than some fathers do. May stopped trying to reach him when she was 16, not out of anger, out of self-preservation. It hurt less to stop than to keep failing. At 16, she found Harmon Marine Supply. It was 45 minutes from Tupelo by county bus, a ride she took every Tuesday and Saturday and most Fridays for 2.5 years, carrying a paperback in her backpack for the ride and arriving at the store already focused, already thinking about whatever problem she'd left unsolved from the last shift. The store sat on a state highway outside of Jackson, a corrugated metal building with a faded sign and a parking lot full of truck beds. The kind of place that smelled like rope and salt water and motor oil, even though the nearest salt water was 200 miles south. The smell was partly the stock bilge pumps, fuel line marine, epoxy life rings, anchor chain, LED navigation lights, and partly the owner, Del Harmon, who had spent 12 years as a Coast Guard rescue swimmer before his knees gave out and he came back to Mississippi to open a store. Del was a large man with a sun-damaged face and the kind of stillness that comes from having spent time in situations where panic kills people. He wore the same thing every day: canvas pants, a gray t-shirt, a ball cap from some marina in Georgia, and he spoke precisely in sentences that contained exactly the words required and no others. He did not have much patience for people who asked questions before they tried to figure something out themselves. He had enormous patience for people who came to him having already tried. May came to him having already tried. She had read the inventory catalogs before her first week was up. She had memorized the difference between marine epoxy and standard construction epoxy. The former was formulated for wet and submerged environments, designed to bond to fiberglass and metal and wood, under conditions that would dissolve standard resins in weeks. She learned what a stuffing box did, how a bilge pump worked, why the orientation of a through-hull fitting mattered, and under what circumstances a bad through-hull could sink a boat. She learned that on a boat ropes were called lines, and that the distinction was not pedantic, but practical in an emergency when someone needed a bowline. And you handed them a cleat line. The difference in language was the difference between seconds. Del watched all of this with an expression that gave away very little. But May was good at reading people who gave away very little, and she could tell that he was paying attention. He was the kind of man who taught by working alongside you and saying almost nothing, which was precisely the way May learned best. He would correct her once. He would never correct her twice. By the end of the first month, she was handling the parts counter alone on slow afternoons while Del worked in the back. By the end of the third month, she was helping customers diagnose problems over the phone. He told her about his younger brother Reed during a slow Tuesday afternoon in the spring of May's second year when they were reorganizing the fastener inventory. The store was empty, except for the two of them, and the radio in the back playing something country and low. Reed lived in Louisiana. Outside of Houma, ran a marine repair shop on a backwater inlet about 10 miles from town. Good mechanic, better than Del, though Del would not say that directly. If you ever needed to disappear somewhere that made sense, Del said, not looking at her, his hands moving through a box of stainless screws by size. Reed's place would be the kind of somewhere. May didn't say anything. She noted it the way she noted things she wasn't sure what to do with carefully, in a place where she could find it again. She had been saving since her first paycheck. Not toward anything specific, not with a plan. She simply understood with the practical certainty that had always been her primary mode of operating. That money in a container was better than money in a wallet. That wallets had a way of emptying themselves under the gentle pressure of daily life. She used a coffee can, the same brand her mother had bought, a red Folgers can that still smelled faintly of grounds. Even after she washed it, a smell she found reassuring in a way she couldn't explain. She kept it in the back of her closet behind her winter boots. By the end of her first year at Harmon Marine, she had $430 in the can. By the end of the second year, she had $880. The spring before her 19th birthday, she passed 1,000. She counted it out on her bed one Sunday evening in late March, laying each bill flat, stacking the 5s and 10s separately, writing the total in the margin of her inventory notebook, $1,140. She felt something when she wrote it, not pride exactly, something quieter. The particular satisfaction of a person who has been told implicitly and explicitly that they are unlikely to accumulate anything, discovering that they have accumulated something. Her father died on her 19th birthday. It was a Wednesday evening in early April. May had worked the morning shift and come home on the 4:15 bus, walked the 3 blocks from the stop to the house, and found the front door unlocked. The way it always was, and the television on in the living room, and Gary sitting in his recliner with his hands in his lap and his eyes open, and a stillness about him that was different from his usual stillness. Because his usual stillness was the stillness of someone who had retreated very far inside themselves. And this was the stillness of an absence with no inside left. The county medical examiner said cardiac arrest. He was 54 years old. He had been sitting there, the examiner estimated, for somewhere between 2 and 4 hours, meaning he had died sometime in the early afternoon. In the particular silence of the house with the television on, and May at work, which was either terrible or merciful, depending on how you looked at it, and May in the days that followed looked at it both ways many times. She called 911. She answered the questions. She signed the forms. She sat on the porch steps while the paramedics went in and out, and she watched a mockingbird in the oak tree at the edge of the yard go through a sequence of calls. Cardinal Blue Jay, something she didn't recognize, back to Cardinal, repeating the sequence without variation, as though it was practicing for something. The grief she felt was not simple. It was layered, and the layers didn't all feel like grief. Some felt like relief. Some felt like guilt about the relief. Some felt like anger at a man who was no longer present to receive it. Some felt like a sadness so deep and structural, it was less like an emotion and more like a geological feature. She had been grieving Gary Calloway since she was 12 years old. The actual death was in some ways just the conclusion of a grief that had already done most of its work. She arranged the funeral with the help of a neighbor named Mrs. Pruitt, who had known Gary and Lynette since before May was born, and who brought a casserole and sat at the kitchen table and made the phone calls that needed to be made without being asked. 14 people came to the service. May paid for it with $312 from the coffee can, supplemented by a small amount from Gary's checking account, which contained less than May had expected. She kept the wool fishing sweater she found in his closet. She had never seen him wear it, but it smelled like cedar and machine oil, like something he had been planning to need someday. She kept the framed photograph from the hallway, Gary and Lynette in 1998 at some lake. She didn't recognize both of them, squinting into the sun and laughing at something outside the frame. Everything else went to Goodwill in 2 boxes and a garbage bag. The landlord, Mr. Delacroix, came by 3 days after the funeral. He was not unkind. He explained that the lease had been in Gary's name, that the property was part of a family estate dispute that had been waiting for this particular tenant situation to resolve, and that the rent was paid through the end of the month, and he was sorry for her loss, and he thought 30 days was fair. May said 30 days was fair. She had expected it. She had been half expecting it since she was 17, the way you expect something you hope won't happen, but prepare for anyway. She spent the following week sorting and packing and cleaning the house with the thoroughness of someone who understands that leaving a place correctly is its own kind of closure. She scrubbed the kitchen. She patched the hole in the bathroom wall where a towel rack had pulled loose. She touched up the paint in the hallway with the leftover white her father had kept in the garage. She did this not for Mr. Delacroix, but for herself because she had learned from watching her mother that the way you leave a place says something about the way you carry it. On her last evening in the house, she sat at the kitchen table and opened the drawer between the takeout menus and the utility bills. The two manila folders were still there. She had forgotten somehow that they would be. She sat very still for a moment, and then she took the folders out and opened them on the table. There were more drawings than she remembered. At least 200, maybe more, spanning from the clumsy crayon sketches of a 4-year-old to the careful pencil renderings she'd been making at 15 and 16, after Dell had started teaching her about hull design. Boats of every kind, boats that made no structural sense, boats that were surprisingly accurate for a child with no reference material, boats that were clearly just the idea of a boat. A shape that meant safety, that meant motion, that meant somewhere else. Her mother had kept everyone. May looked at them for a long time. Then she took the best 12 and put them in a flat envelope that she slid into the outer pocket of her backpack. She put the rest of the folder on top of the Goodwill pile. She didn't know if that was the right thing to do. She did know that 12 felt like enough, and that carrying all of them would have been carrying something too heavy to move forward with. The morning the lease ended, she walked out of the house at 8:15 with a backpack and a duffel bag and the coffee can in her left hand. She pulled the door closed behind her and stood on the porch for a moment, one hand still on the doorknob looking at the street. The mockingbird was back in the oak tree. It was doing cardinal again. She let go of the doorknob. The bus to Jackson left at 9:15. The bus from Jackson to Baton Rouge left at 11:40. May sat in the Jackson terminal with her bags between her feet and the coffee can in her lap and looked at the departures board for a long time. She had $1,128 in the cans, at $1,140 she'd counted on her bed in March, minus the $12 she'd contributed toward the flowers for Gary's service. She had no job lined up and no place to stay and no plan that extended beyond the next 48 hours. She took out her phone and opened the photo roll and scrolled back to a picture she had taken 2 years ago, a candid shot of her mother she had found tucked inside a library book when she was cleaning out the house. In it, Lynette was maybe 30, sitting at the same kitchen table, laughing at something outside the frame, holding up a piece of paper, so small it was clearly a child's drawing. You couldn't see the drawing itself, but Lynette's expression left no question about what she thought of it. May looked at that photograph for a long time in the Jackson bus terminal. Then she bought a ticket to Baton Rouge with a connection to Houma, Louisiana, because Del Harmon had said more than once, and in that precise way of his, that if she ever needed to disappear somewhere that made sense, his brother Reed was the kind of somewhere. And May, sitting in the bus station with everything she owned in 2 bags and $1,200 in a coffee can, understood that she had been planning to go there for 2 years without admitting it to herself. The ride south took 4 hours, including the connection. She watched Mississippi give way to Louisiana through the window, the land flattening and widening, the trees changing oaks thinning into cypress, the ground going soft and dark, water appearing at the edges of things, and then everywhere filling the spaces between trees, lying flat under the gray sky like something thinking. Spanish moss hung from the cypress limbs in long gray curtains that moved in the warm air coming off the water. The light was different here, not brighter exactly, but wetter, filtered through the moisture that hung in the atmosphere like a curtain of its own, turning everything gold and green and slow. May pressed her forehead against the glass and felt something she couldn't name settle in her chest. She had never been to Louisiana. She had never been south of Jackson. But this landscape felt less like a new place and more like a place she had been approximating her entire life, the place on the other side of all those crayon drawings. Reed Harmon was waiting at the Homer bus terminal in a dented Ford F250 with the driver's window down and one elbow resting on the door in the early evening heat. He looked exactly like Dell. The same wide-set eyes, the same economy of expression, the same quality of stillness. But where Dell's face was clean-shaven and precise, Reed's was covered in a short dark beard going gray at the jaw, and where Dell always looked like he was preparing to say something, Reed looked like he had already decided not to. He nodded when May climbed in. The truck smelled like motor oil and river mud, and the particular sweet salt smell that May associated with the Harmon Marine stockroom, which meant it was the smell of work, the smell of things that existed to keep other things functioning. And she found it immediately and completely familiar. Reed drove with the easy looseness of someone who had made the same route enough times that his hands knew where to go without consulting the rest of him. He didn't ask how the trip was. He didn't ask about Dell. He drove south and west out of Homer through streets lined with live oaks and into a landscape that grew progressively darker and more waterlogged. The road, narrowing the trees, pressing closer, the inlets and channels appearing on both sides with increasing frequency, until May had the sense of driving across something that wasn't quite land and wasn't quite water, but was negotiating between the two on terms it had worked out long ago. The shop was a wide-open wooden structure with a corrugated metal roof set back from a narrow backwater inlet at the end of a gravel road. 3 bare bulbs hung from the ceiling on long cords and threw yellow light across the concrete floor, and the collection of outboard motors arranged along the south wall in various states of disassembly. A dock extended from the back of the property into the inlet, and along the dock tied with weathered lines were a shallow draft fishing skiff, an aluminum john boat, a cabin cruiser with weeds growing along its waterline, and at the very end, floating low and listing perhaps 2 degrees to port, an old houseboat. Reed stopped at the dock's edge and pointed. That one belonged to Calvin Broussard, died last year. No family they could find, not after 14 months of looking. Slip fees come to $10 even. Dell said you might be looking for something. May walked to the end of the dock. The houseboat was about 30 feet long, maybe 8 feet of beam. The hull was steel-painted white, originally now a landscape of rust and bare metal, and the ghost of paint. The cabin sat on top of the hull, a flat-roofed wooden box with peeling turquoise paint and 2 small windows per side, and a weathered wooden door facing the dock. An old life ring hung crooked on the port railing. The rope frayed to a single strand. The whole boat sat low in the water, pulled down by whatever was inside it, and whatever water had seeped through the hull over years of neglect. May stood at the dock's edge and looked at the boat for a long time. She could see the rust. She could see the soft spots in the cabin wood, where moisture had gotten in and started its slow conversion of structure into nothing. She could see the list, which meant bilge water or worse. She could also see the lines. The hull's entry was clean, a long flat bow designed for slow water, for the kind of travel that wasn't travel at all. But the decision to be in one place without being fixed to it. The cabin was proportional. The overall shape was low and honest, and not trying to be anything other than what it was, a place to live on the water, designed with the understanding that the water would always be the point. How much? May asked. $10. The marina was going to sell her for scrap. I told them to hold it. May opened the coffee can. She counted 10 $1 bills into Reed's open palm without speaking. He looked at the money. He looked at her. You know how to caulk a seam? Yes. Marine epoxy. You know the mix ratio for thickened epoxy. 5 parts base to 1 part hardener for fairing, 3-to-1 for structural feel. West system or system 3 depending on the working temperature. Reed was quiet for a moment. Dell said you knew your stuff. I didn't fully believe him. He handed her a key, a small brass key on a ring with a cork float. The kind of key used on a boat specifically so you could find it if you dropped it in the water. Sleep on it tonight. We start in the morning. May stepped onto the boat as the sun went down behind the cypress trees, and the bayou turned 100 shades of amber and gold. the water holding the colors. The way still water holds things completely without distortion, until the light changes and then letting go of all of it at once. The deck flexed under her feet, not alarmingly, just enough to remind her that she was standing on something that floated, that existed in negotiation with the water below it, rather than in opposition to it. She unlocked the cabin door and pushed it open and stood in the doorway. The cabin was small, 10 feet by 12 maybe. The built-in bunk against the starboard wall had a mattress so far gone, it had returned to something more like compost than foam. The galley on the port side had a propane stove so corroded that the burner knobs had fused into a single unit of rust. 2 folding chairs, a small table, cabinets along the walls with doors swollen shut from humidity. A ceiling low enough that May at 5 feet 6 could reach it with her palm flat. The air was heavy with mildew and the particular sweetness of water-damaged wood that has had enough time to move past damage into something like acceptance. Somewhere in the walls, a seam was letting in the smell of the bayou mud and cypress resin and the organic warmth of standing water that had been standing long enough to develop its own ecology. May set her backpack on the table. She set the coffee can beside it. She turned slowly in the center of the cabin and let herself feel the boat moving under her. The barely there rocking of a vessel at rest, responding to the minute disturbances of the water breathing with the bayou. Something happened in her chest. Not a dramatic thing. More like a door somewhere she hadn't known there was a door opening a crack. The specific dimensions of the cabin, too small to be comfortable in any conventional sense. Just the right size to be entirely within reach of everything, felt familiar in a way that had nothing to do with having been there before. The quality of light through the small windows was green gold and watery. The light of a place that exists in permanent negotiation with the things that grow in and around it. And it was nothing like the light in Tupelo and everything like the light in those crayon drawings her mother had kept in a manila folder in the kitchen drawer. Her mother had seen this. Lynette had understood before May understood herself that her daughter was moving toward water. She had kept the evidence. She had kept all of it, every single drawing, 200 plus pieces of paper that amounted to a map of a direction May had been traveling her entire life without knowing she was traveling. May sat down on the rotted bunk frame and looked at the cabin in the last of the evening light and let herself sit inside the strange specific weight of being exactly where she was supposed to be without having had any plan to get there. Outside, the bayou filled with sound as the dark came in. Frogs in enormous chorus layered an intricate calling from every direction at once. Owls low in the cypresses. The slow lap of water against the steel hull, a rhythm so patient and regular that it was less like a sound and more like a tempo, the underlying beat of everything else. Once a loud splash, very close, the kind of sound that could be a large fish or could be something watching from the bank. And May, listening, decided not to investigate the distinction and found that she was smiling. She slept on the floor in a sleeping bag that night with the rotted mattress shoved against the wall and the coffee can on the deck beside her head. The boards under the sleeping bag were gritty with old dirt but solid. The deck was still good, the steel beneath it still true. She could feel the boat's breathing under her back, the tiny adjustments it made in response to currents she couldn't see, and at some point in the late hours, lying in the dark and listening to the frogs. She stopped feeling like a person who had lost everything and started feeling like a person who had arrived somewhere. In the morning, Reed came at 6 with 2 cups of coffee in paper cups and a paper bag of beignets from a place in town. And they sat on the dock in the early heat and talked about what needed to happen to make the boat livable and then survivable and then good. The list was substantial. The hull needed to be hauled out, sanded to bare metal, treated, epoxied, primed and painted. The cabin needed to come down to its frame and be rebuilt from scratch, new plywood, new insulation, new wiring, new roof. The galley needed a new stove properly vented. The electrical system was suspect enough that Reed said he'd rather she not plug anything in until they'd replaced it entirely. The bilge pump was seized. The freshwater system didn't exist. 6 months if you do it right, Reed said. Maybe 8. You staying on her while you work. Yes. It's going to be rough. I can do rough. Reed drank his coffee and looked at the boat. Dell said that about you, that you could do rough without making it a thing. She started that day with the bilge, because the bilge was where you started the lowest point. The place where everything that got in eventually collected. And if you didn't know the condition of the bilge, you didn't know the condition of anything. She pulled the hatch in the cabin floor and shined her flashlight down. The bilge was full of dark water, 6 inches deep, the color and opacity of black tea sitting still, with the patience of water that has been somewhere long enough to feel it belongs there. It smelled like iron and old engine fuel, and the particular dark organic smell of a space that hasn't had fresh air in years. May got a plastic bucket and spent the next 2 hours crouched at the bilge hatch, reaching down with a can, filling the bucket, carrying the bucket to the stern, and dumping it over the railing, going back, reaching down again. The space was too small for anything but her arms from the shoulder down, and by the end of the first hour, her back was locked in a single cramped position, and her arms were burning. She did not stop. She worked with the systematic focus of someone who has decided that the only way through an unpleasant task is through it. 2 hours, then the bucket came up less than half full, and then quarter full, and then the can was scraping bare steel at the bottom. May sat back on her heels. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist. She picked up the flashlight and shined it into the bilge, now empty of water, and moved the beam slowly across the bottom. There was something there. It was a box. Wooden rectangular, sitting on a small platform of wood that had been deliberately constructed to lift it above the bilge floor. Someone had built a little pedestal carefully, with the specific intention of keeping whatever was in the box clear of any water that accumulated below it. The box itself was a military footlocker, the kind soldiers had taken to wars, with brass hardware at the corners, and 2 leather straps running across the lid, and a heavy padlock through the hasp. The brass was tarnished to the color of old pennies. The leather straps were dry, not cracked, preserved somehow despite everything around them, rotting as though whatever was inside had its own will toward survival. The padlock was rusted completely through. It was not going to open with a key. May looked at the footlocker for a long time, moving the flashlight beam over its surface, the way she had moved it over the hull, assessing, noting, cataloging. Then she climbed out of the bilge, walked to the dock, and went to find Reed. He followed her back without asking questions. He looked down through the hatch at the footlocker for a long moment. He scratched his jaw where the beard was going gray. When he finally spoke, it was in the measured way of a man who is thinking out loud and not performing thinking. Calvin Broussard, he said. 3 tours in Vietnam. Came home in 1972 and bought this boat 7 years later and lived on it from then until the day he died. Worked as a mechanic in Houma. Good one. People drove 40 miles to have him look at an engine. Never married. No family anyone could find. People used to wonder what he did with his money, because he worked steady for decades and spent almost nothing. He paused. He looked at the footlocker. He looked at May. I think we just found out where it went. Reed went to the shop and came back with a hacksaw. He set it on the deck beside the bilge hatch without a word. And then he stepped back, and May understood that the stepping back was deliberate, a man drawing a line between what was his to do and what was hers. She picked up the hacksaw. She lowered herself back to the bilge hatch and reached down and set the blade against the shackle of the padlock and began to cut. The rust had eaten through most of the metal's integrity, and the blade moved faster than she expected, the shackle parting in 2 strokes with a sound like a dry branch snapping. The lock fell to the bilge floor with a dull clank that the steel hull amplified into something bigger than itself. Together they lifted the footlocker out through the hatch. It was heavier than its size, suggested the weight distributed evenly in a way that meant the contents were dense and numerous and packed with care. They set it on the cabin floor, and May knelt in front of it and unbuckled the leather straps. They were stiff but intact, the brass buckles grinding but functional, and lifted the lid. The smell that came up was dry and mineral old canvas, and the faint metallic scent of aged silver. A smell with no moisture in it, which meant whoever had packed this box had understood that moisture was the enemy of preservation, that whatever they were putting away they intended to keep. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth folded neatly at the edges, were rows of small canvas bags. Each one was tied with a length of plain cotton twine and bore a paper tag the size of a luggage label. The year written on it in faded ink, a careful hand. Someone who had practiced writing numbers the way some people practice signatures, wanting them to be legible decades later. The earliest tag read 1979. May lifted the bag and felt its weight shift, dense, coin-heavy, the particular gravity of silver that has been still for a long time. She untied the twine and opened the bag and tipped a portion of the contents into her palm. Morgan's silver dollars and walking Liberty halves cold against her skin, their surfaces dulled by time but structurally intact. She set it down. She lifted another 1983 heavier than the first, a third 1991 lighter. The year's difficulty visible in the reduced weight, the way a growth ring is thin in a drought year. She worked through the bags in sequence, not opening all of them, but lifting each one, reading the year, feeling the weight. Some years were thin. Some were dense enough that the seams of the canvas strained slightly. The bag from 2003 was the heaviest, so full that Calvin had doubled the knot on the twine. There were 43 bags. She counted them twice. The years ran from 1979 to 2018 with two gaps, 1985 and 1992, those years absent for reasons that would become clear in time. 41 years of setting aside what could be set aside. Some bags held only coins. Some held folded paper money secured with rubber bands so old they had fused to the bills. One bag from 1997 held nothing but mercury dimes, dozens of them, as though Calvin had been collecting that particular coin that year with specific intent. At the very bottom of the footlocker, beneath the last bag, lay two things: a folded American flag, the kind presented at military funerals, folded into its tight triangle, the blue field of stars face up, the creases so sharp they might have been pressed yesterday. And a sealed envelope, the paper slightly yellowed, but the seal intact with two lines written on the front in the same careful hand as the bag tags to whoever finds this. May picked up the envelope. She looked at it for a long moment. Reed was leaning against the cabin door frame, and she could feel him not saying anything in the specific way of a person who understands that some moments are not theirs to fill. She opened the envelope. The letter inside was a single page written on both sides in the same precise hand. The letters small and evenly spaced, the lines straight without the aid of ruling, the writing of a man who had learned penmanship at a time when penmanship was taught as a discipline. My name is Calvin Broussard. I was born in Cocodrie, Louisiana in 1948. I served in the United States Marines from 1966 to 1972. I came home with a head full of things I could not put down, and the only place I found where I could put them down, even partway, was on this boat on this water, where it was quiet enough to hear myself think and small enough to manage. I bought this boat in 1979 for $400. I have lived on it every year since. Every year I saved what I could in a bag with the year on it because I needed to see the time go by in some form I could hold. And this was the form that made sense to me. I do not have family. The men I served with are mostly gone. There is no one I can leave this to, which I have thought about for longer than I'd like to admit. But I refuse to let it disappear into nothing. A life should leave a mark somewhere, even a small one, even one that only one person ever sees. If you found this footlocker, you came onto my boat for a reason. Maybe you needed somewhere to be. Maybe you were trying to build something. Maybe you were lost in the specific way that has nothing to do with directions. I was all of those things, and I was them for a long time. I hope this helps. The boat is a good one. She has carried me a long way without ever leaving her sleep. Some boats do that. Some lives are like that too. Take care of her. Calvin Broussard, May 2018. May read it twice. The second time more slowly, the way you read something when the first reading has already changed the ground you're standing on, and you need to read it again to find your footing. Then she folded it along its original creases and slid it back into the envelope and held the envelope in both hands and looked at the space in front of her, without focusing on anything in it. Reed let the silence run its full length, then carefully. "We need to call Marcy Fowler before you do anything else with any of this." Marcy Fowler was a property and estates attorney in Houma, who had an office above a hardware store on Main Street and a reputation for being the kind of lawyer who told you what was actually true rather than what you wanted to hear, which was the only kind worth paying for. She drove out to the dock that same afternoon, a woman in her late 40s with short graying hair and the focused expression of someone whose professional life had trained her to locate the relevant facts in a situation quickly and organize them before speaking. She looked at the Footlocker. She looked at the bags. She read Calvin's letter standing at the cabin table, then read it again sitting down. She asked May 3 questions: when she had purchased the boat, from whom, and whether she had a bill of sale. And when May produced the handwritten slip Reed had given her, Marcy studied it and set it on the table beside the letter. "Here is what's true." Marcy said, her voice the verbal equivalent of her expression, focused, organized, free of performance. "Calvin Broussard died without a will and without designated beneficiaries. His estate went into probate. The parish made the required efforts to locate next of kin for 14 months. No one came forward. His identified assets were classified as unclaimed property. The boat was sold to satisfy the outstanding slip fees. You purchased it through that process with the appropriate documentation." She paused. The contents of the boat discovered post-purchase are a more nuanced question. But the letter constitutes a clear statement of intent from the decedent, directing the contents to whoever came into possession of the vessel. Combined with the exhausted probate process and the valid sale documentation, you have a defensible claim. We file a formal declaration of discovered property with the parish. We wait 90 days. If no creditor or heir appears, and given the 14-month probate search, that probability is low, the assets are formally yours. May looked at her. 90 days. 90 days, Marcy confirmed. "In the meantime, I'd recommend not spending any of it." May looked at the Footlocker, at the 43 bags arranged in their rows, at the folded flag and the envelope. 90 days. The boat needed 8 months of work. She had $1,116 left in her coffee can. 90 days was not a problem in terms of the timeline. It was a problem in terms of the weight. 90 days of living with the knowledge of what was in the Footlocker, without being able to regard it as hers, without being able to plan around it, without being able to feel settled in something that might still be taken away. She had lived with uncertainty before. She was good at it. It was still uncertainty. That night, she lay in her sleeping bag and looked at the ceiling and thought about Calvin Broussard. She tried to construct him from the things she knew. A Marine who had come back from a war that the country had spent 50 years arguing about. A mechanic. A man who saved silver dollars in canvas bags because he needed to see his time go by in a form he could hold. A man who had, as she would soon learn, loved a woman named Nora Delacombe before the war and come home to find that she hadn't waited. That last piece came from Pell Arsenault, who arrived at the dock on a Sunday afternoon 2 weeks after May had moved in without announcement and stood at the end of the dock, looking at the boat for a long time before he said anything. Pell was in his 80s, a retired tugboat captain, who moved with the deliberate economy of someone who has learned to conserve everything, including motion. He had known Calvin since they were boys in Cocodrie. He had come to see who had the boat. He looked at May the way old men sometimes look at young women who are doing unexpected things, not dismissive, not surprised exactly, but recalibrating. Then he sat down on the dock, his legs hanging over the edge, and told her about Nora. She had been Calvin's since high school. The kind of knowing that calcifies into certainty before either person is old enough to understand what certainty costs. He had bought a ring in 1970 before his second deployment. When he shipped out again, she gave it back. She had waited through the first tour and decided she could not wait through a second, which was a decision Pell said he did not judge because he had known men who came back from that war, broken in ways that their families spent the rest of their lives managing. and Nora had been 22 and had not signed up for that. Calvin never married. He came back in 1972 and bought the boat in 1979 and kept the ring. Pell knew this because Calvin had told him once in the specific way of a man who mentions a thing once because it needs to be said and never mentions it again, because saying it once was already more than he intended. May thought about the ring while she worked in the days that followed. She had found it 3 days after moving in the narrow drawer of the galley table that she had forced open with a flathead screwdriver. The drawer had swollen shut from humidity and hadn't opened in years. Inside was the ring, a simple band of silver, and a piece of paper folded to the size of a playing card on which Calvin had written in his careful hand, "I should have given this to her. I never did." She put it in a small tin she was using to collect the things that seemed like they needed to be kept, but whose purpose was not yet clear, the ring. A photograph of 2 young men in uniform she'd found tucked behind a cabinet panel. A newspaper page from 1983 she discovered inside the cabin wall when she started pulling out the old insulation folded once and pressed flat between the sheathing and the vapor barrier, like a time capsule someone had placed there without declaring it as such. She pulled the cabin apart in the 3rd week of May. The work was loud and destructive in the way that the first phase of any serious restoration is. You had to be willing to wreck things before you could fix them, to pull out everything that was compromised before you could understand what was sound. She stripped the cabin to its frame in 4 days, tearing out the rotted plywood walls in chunks, cutting away the corroded wiring, working through insulation that had gone from functional to something that now resembled gray moss. She filled 3 large contractor bags with material that had crossed the line from degraded to dangerous. And when the cabin was stripped down to bare steel deck and wooden frame, she stood inside the skeleton of it and felt the Gulf warm air moving through from every direction and understood that she was standing inside the bones of a life someone had built here, the actual physical structure of 40 years of choosing to stay. When she hauled the boat out in the 1st week of June, Reed operating the winch system he'd built in the yard, the boat coming slowly up onto wooden blocks with a sound like a slow exhalation, and walked around the bare hull in the morning light, she found the initials. They were on the bow port side, low on the hull, near the waterline, scratched into the steel with something sharp, a nail maybe or a knife point. CB and ND and the year 1971 cut beneath them. The letters were small, not meant to be seen from the dock, meant to be seen by someone who was close to the hull and looking. Calvin had scratched them here after he bought the boat in 1979. She understood marking the steel with a name that no longer belonged to his present, only to the part of him that had decided to carry it forward anyway. The way you mark a wall to record a height, because the marking is less about the measurement and more about refusing to let the moment go unwitnessed. Reed came around the bow and looked at the initials. ND, that's Nora Delacombe. Pell would know if she's still around. Pell knew Nora had died in 2009 in Shreveport. She had married and had 2 daughters and had lived a long life, which was the right thing to have done, and did not make Calvin's carrying of her any less real. One of the daughters, the younger one, Diane, was still alive, living in Baton Rouge. May filed this information in the space where she kept things she wasn't ready to act on, but wasn't willing to lose. She sanded the hull over 14 days. Power sander, foam ear protection, a respirator, and the particular discipline of someone who has decided that the work is the thing and everything else. The aching shoulders, the ringing ears, the greet that worked itself into every surface is simply the texture of the work. Not a separate problem. The rust came off in brown clouds. The bare steel underneath was silver in the morning light and bronze by afternoon. And watching it emerge from the rust felt like watching something that had been waiting a long time to be seen again. She treated the rust bits with phosphoric acid, converting the remaining oxidation to iron phosphate, stable, no longer aggressive, no longer eating. Then she applied marine epoxy to the structural repairs, building up the damaged sections layer by layer, feathering the edges the way Reed showed her, working the material to a consistency that held its shape without sagging. 2 coats of epoxy primer applied in the early mornings when the temperature was below 80. Then 3 coats of marine enamel in a color she had chosen from a chip card at the marine supply in Houma, a deep blue so saturated it read almost black in low light and opened into something closer to midnight sea in direct sun. The man behind the counter mixed it without needing to consult anything, the way someone mixes a color they've made before and remember in their hands. Reed stood in the yard the afternoon she finished the final coat. He walked around the hull, once slowly, not speaking. Then he stopped and looked at the bow and said, "I have been working on boats for 35 years, and I have never seen a first-time hull job come out like that." He didn't elaborate. May understood that the absence of elaboration was itself the point. The cabin took longer. She rebuilt the walls with marine plywood sheathed in cedar, insulating each cavity with closed-cell spray foam before closing up the panels. New windows larger than the originals placed to catch the morning light from the east and the evening light from the west, so the interior would always have the quality of light that corresponded to the time of day. She rebuilt the roof with marine plywood and rolled membrane roofing, and in the center of the roof, positioned over the table, a 12-inch skylight that let a column of sun fall straight down into the interior, moving across the floor as the day turned. The new propane stove went in with a proper regulator, a dedicated shutoff at the tank, and a carbon monoxide detector mounted to the ceiling. The wiring she ran herself, all marine-grade cable color-coded to the standard Dell had taught her, every connection made with proper marine terminals, no shortcuts. A solar panel on the roof connected to a battery bank in a sealed compartment under the rebuilt bunk. A 30-gallon freshwater tank under the forward sole fed by a deck fill and pumped to the galley sink by a foot-operated hand pump. She built the furniture herself from cedar and pine. A built-in bench along the port side with storage below. A drop-leaf table that folded flush against the forward bulkhead when not needed. The bunk in the bow built to her dimensions exactly with 4 drawers beneath it on full extension slides, and bookshelves on every available wall. She had been acquiring books since the second week, filling the shelves methodically. Marine engineering references, field guides to bayou birds and plants and fish. A complete set of Conrad she found in a box outside a house on the way back from town one afternoon. A worn paperback of Moby Dick that had belonged to her mother. The name Lynette Calloway, written inside the front cover in blue ink in a handwriting May knew better than her own. She kept Calvin's Footlocker. She cleaned the brass corners and oiled the leather straps until they were supple again, and slid the footlocker under the bunk, where she could see the brass corners when she made the bed in the morning. Inside, she kept the folded flag, Calvin's letter in its envelope, and the 1979 bag, the first year, empty now but present, a record of where it had started. Adeline Fontenot started bringing gumbo on Fridays about 6 weeks after May arrived, driving out to Reed's dock in a pickup with a cooler in the bed, and transferring a mason jar from the cooler to May's hands without ceremony, the jar warm from whatever heat the cooler had retained. She was in her 60s, wide-shouldered, with the physical confidence of a woman who regards a kitchen as a domain rather than a room. She refused money every time May offered it. Calvin used to bring me crawfish every Friday for 20 years. I figure I owe the boat something. It was the kind of explanation that required no elaboration. A transaction of obligation running forward in time because the original party was no longer available to receive it. Buddy Trosclair came a few weeks after that. He crawfished the shallow flats north of the inlet, and he showed May how to set traps along the bank below the dock where the water was shallow and the current slow enough that the traps would hold position. Chicken necks for bait. Check them at dawn before the herons work the shallows. Within 3 weeks, she had a reliable supply of crawfish which she boiled in a pot on the new stove with cayenne and lemon, and ate on the rebuilt deck in the evenings, the bayou going gold and purple around her. Pell came back on a Sunday in late July, and they sat on the dock the way they had gotten into the habit, both facing the water the conversation emerging sideways rather than straight on the way some conversations work better. And Pell told her about Dauphin. Calvin had gotten the dog in 1985, which answered the question of the missing savings bag from that year a year, whose resources had gone elsewhere towards something living rather than something stored. A mutt, dark brown with one white ear, half retriever, and half something that had never been catalogued. Calvin had named him after a passage in Mobile Bay for reasons he had not explained. The dog had lived on the boat with him for 14 years and been buried in the cypress grove on the far side of the marina property, under a live oak at the edge of the tree line, with a wooden marker Calvin had made himself. May went looking for it the next morning. She found it in the shadows under the oak. The wooden marker weathered to a gray that matched the Spanish moss hanging from the limbs above it. The carved letters almost invisible. Dauphin 1985 to 1999. She stood there alone for a while. The grove was quiet in the way of places that are genuinely quiet. Not just the absence of noise, but the presence of something else, some accumulated stillness. She thought about Calvin burying his dog here and going back to the boat and continuing to live on it, because continuing to live on things is what you do. It is the only option that does not require stopping. She thought about her father sitting in his recliner and the television on and the particular quality of his stillness. She thought about her mother's hands setting a drawing into a manila folder. She had not cried since the funeral. She cried now standing under the oak in the cypress grove, not for Dauphin specifically, and not for Calvin specifically, and not for anyone specifically, but for all of it at once, for the accumulated weight of people and animals and years and small acts of preservation that do not get witnessed, that happen in private, that only matter because someone decided they mattered. And for the terrifying fragility of that decision, how easily it could have gone the other way, how easily the Footlocker could have gone to the scrapyard with the hull, how easily a drawing made by a 4-year-old could have been thrown away instead of filed. She cried until she was done, and then she walked back to the boat and made coffee and got back to work. The 90 days ended on a Tuesday in early September, the heat still dense and wet, the bayou giving off its late summer steam in the mornings. Marcy Fowler called at 8:15 while May was on the dock drinking coffee and watching a great blue heron work the shallows 20 feet off the port bow, with the focused patience of a creature that has never once in its life been in a hurry. Marcy's voice had the same quality it always had: organized, precise, stripped of anything that wasn't information. No creditor had appeared. No heir had filed. The parish had completed its final review. The assets discovered aboard the vessel were as of that morning legally and formally May's. May thanked her and hung up and sat with the phone in her lap and looked at the heron. The heron did not acknowledge the development. It took one slow step forward in the shallows, its leg lifting and lowering with the deliberate grace of something that understood water resistance, and then it stopped and waited again. She went inside and opened the drawer under the bunk and looked at the footlocker for a while. The brass corners caught the light from the skylight above the column of morning sun that fell directly onto the table, and from there bounced around the cedar paneled interior in warm fragments. The cabin smelled like cedar and coffee and the faint mineral trace of the bayou that came through the open windows on the morning air. She drove Reed's truck into Homer and opened a bank account. The coin dealer from Thibodeau that Reed had called 2 weeks earlier had already assessed the silver content and provided written valuations. The bank's currency specialist worked from those valuations and from the face value of the paper money. He made neat stacks, he ran totals, he checked his work. The final number was $48,200. May signed the deposit forms. She walked out of the bank into the September heat and sat in Reed's truck in the parking lot for 10 minutes without starting the engine. $48,000 was not a fortune. It was not the kind of number that changed the fundamental conditions of her life. But it was enough to finish the boat correctly enough to not be afraid of what came next for a while. Enough to do something with that wasn't just survival. She thought about Calvin sitting on the boat every December, or every January pulling out a new canvas bag, writing the year on the tag in his careful hand, putting away what he could. 40 years of small decisions accumulating into something large enough to matter to a person he would never meet. She drove back to the dock. Reed was in the shop working on an outboard when she came back. She stood in the doorway and said, "I want to set aside $5,000 for a fund, apprenticeship grants for young people in the parish who want to learn marine repair. I want it named for Calvin Broussard." Reed set down his tool. He looked at her for a long moment. The specific look of a man deciding whether what he's feeling is surprise or recognition, and settling on recognition. He picked up the paper she had written the details on, read it once, set it back down. "I'll call Marcy." His voice quiet, carrying more weight than the words. He turned back to the engine without another word, which was the most Reed could offer and the most May needed. And she understood that the turned back was not dismissal, but acknowledgement, the gesture of a man who has decided you belong in his vicinity, and therefore no longer needs to watch you prove it. The fund was established 2 weeks later. The first grant went to a 17-year-old from Dulac named Sébastien, who had been coming around Reed's shop for months doing odd jobs in exchange for time near the engines, the kind of persistence that Reed had apparently decided deserved formalization. May didn't make a ceremony of it. She left the check with Reed and let him handle the presentation, because the point was not the presentation. She started working at the shop formally in October, trading labor for slip fees and shop access. The outboard motors in particular came back to her hands quickly. Their systems clean and logical, every component serving a function you could trace from the fuel inlet to the propeller shaft. She had been good at this in theory, learning from Dell's catalogs and patient corrections. She discovered now that she was better at it in practice, that her hands had a diagnostic instinct, that no amount of reading could have produced the ability to locate a problem by sound and feel before the instruments confirmed it. Customers started asking for her by the 3rd month. Reed mentioned this once briefly without looking up from whatever he was working on. "People are asking for you by name." Then he moved on, because information delivered was information complete, and dwelling on it served no structural purpose. The ring stayed in her thoughts through the fall and into winter. It sat in the small tin on the shelf above the bunk, and she was aware of it with the low-grade awareness you have of something unfinished, a task whose execution you haven't yet worked out. She asked Pell more about Nora's daughter Diane in October, and Pell gave her what he knew: Diane Whitfield, living in Baton Rouge, a schoolteacher, early 50s. Pell had met her once at Nora's funeral and described her as a woman with her mother's face and the particular composure of someone who had grown up in a household with things that were not discussed. May called Marcy and asked how to find someone in Baton Rouge. Marcy found Diane Whitfield's address in 20 minutes through public records and the kind of professional database access that lawyers had and civilians did not. And May spent a week composing a letter by hand, drafting it 4 times before she had the right version. Brief, factual, containing no claim on Diane's emotions, explaining only what she had found and why she was writing. She included a copy of Calvin's letter and a description of the ring. Diane called on a Thursday evening 3 weeks later. Her voice had the quality Pell had suggested, composed, but with something working underneath it. The specific quality of a person maintaining composure over something that matters more than they had prepared for. Her mother had kept a photograph in the drawer of her bedside table for her entire adult life. A photo of a young man in uniform, early 20s, with the straight-ahead look of someone who had learned to face a camera without blinking. Diane had grown up knowing the photograph existed and knowing it was not a subject for discussion, and she had understood as an adult that this was not her mother hiding something, but her mother carrying something which were different things, and she had respected the difference. She had never known the man's name. Nora had died with it kept. May listened without interrupting. Then, when the silence on the other end indicated that Diane had finished, "His name was Calvin Broussard. He was from Cocodrie. He was a Marine. He bought a ring for your mother in 1970, and she gave it back when he shipped out for the second time. He kept it for 48 years. He wrote a note about it that I found on this boat. May paused. I think the ring belongs with you. Diane was quiet for a long time. Why are you doing this? The ring is yours. Everything on that boat is yours. May looked out the window at the bayou where the winter light was coming through the bare cypress limbs in long horizontal slats the color of warm silver. Because he couldn't give it to her. But I can give it to you. That's a different kind of thing, but it's still something. Diane came to Houma on a Saturday in January. Driving up from Baton Rouge in a gray sedan, a woman in her early 50s, with her mother's cheekbones and the careful eyes of someone arriving at a place they have been thinking about for a long time. May met her on the dock. They shook hands. May offered coffee. They sat at the drop-leaf table in the cedar-paneled cabin, with the skylight letting in a rectangle of winter sun. And May gave her the ring in the small tin, and Calvin's note, and a copy of the letter, and the photograph of the two young men in uniform, one of them she was now fairly certain from his bearing. And the stillness of his expression was Calvin, at 20-something, before whatever the war had done to his face. Diane held the ring in her palm and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then she would have wanted to know he was all right. That's what she would have wanted. Her voice stayed even, but her eyes did not entirely cooperate. I think he was. I think the boat was how he was all right. May thought about that afterward, after Diane had driven back to Baton Rouge with the ring and the photograph and the note. The boat was how he was all right. She turned the phrase over in her mind, the way you turn over something that has reached into a thing you already understood and named it properly for the first time. Calvin had not been happy in any simple sense. A man who kept a ring for 48 years and scratched initials into the bow of a boat he hadn't yet bought was not a man without grief. But he had been all right. He had found the form that worked for him, the dimensions he could manage, the specific arrangement of water and quiet and purposeful labor in which his particular self could function. She had been doing the same thing without knowing it since she arrived. In February, Reed asked her to take point on a complete system rebuild for a 40-foot cruiser that a man from New Orleans was bringing in for winter work. It was the most complex project she had handled independently. New electrical throughout, new plumbing, engine service, bottom paint, interior work. Reed walked through it with her, once checking her materials list, making 2 corrections and initialing the rest. And then he stepped back and let her run it. She ran it. The work took 6 weeks. The owner came to take delivery on a cold, clear Thursday in early March, a man in his 60s who had owned boats his entire adult life and had the kind of practiced critical eye that notices details you thought were invisible. He walked the boat from stem to stern, opened panels, checked connections, tested systems. And when he was done, he stood on the dock and looked at Reed and said, "Whoever did the electrical on this boat is better than most professionals I've hired." Reed looked at May and said nothing, which was the only thing that needed to be said. One evening in late March, May sat on the deck of the houseboat in the last of the day's warmth and watched the sun go through its nightly negotiation with the cypress tree line. The sky moved through amber into rose, into the particular blue-gray that preceded dark, and the water caught all of it and held it without distortion. The bayou acting as a second sky below the first, so that the boat appeared to float between 2 versions of the same fading light. The Heron stood in the shallows off the port bow, motionless, waiting. She looked at the boat around her, the dark blue hull that had emerged from the rust, the rebuilt cedar cabin, the skylight going translucent in the fading light, the bookshelves visible through the open cabin door. The footlocker she knew was under the bunk, the brass corners catching whatever light reached that far. She thought about Calvin sitting on this same deck, maybe in this same position, watching the same light move across the same water. 2 people years apart arriving at the same 30 feet of steel hull and bayou water, because something in each of them had been oriented this way since before they understood what orientation meant. Calvin with his service behind him, and his grief and his ring, and his canvas bags. May with her mother's drawings and her father's slow disappearance and her coffee can. Different losses, different years, same pull toward the same water. She opened the notebook she had been keeping in the drawer, beneath the bunk, and wrote at the top of a new page, Calvin Broussard was born in Cocodrie, Louisiana in 1948. She wrote his whole name and his whole span of years, and what she knew of what had filled them. She wrote about the boat and the bags and the ring and Dauphin and the newspaper in the wall. She wrote about Nora carefully without claiming to understand what had passed between two people she could only approximate from the evidence they had left. She wrote what Pell had told her, and what the initials on the bow had told her, and what the note in the galley drawer had told her. I should have given this to her. I never did, which was perhaps the most honest sentence in the entire collection. The admission of a specific regret that Calvin had been unwilling to either act on or discard, choosing instead to keep it where he would see it regularly, which was its own kind of honoring. She wrote for an hour. When she stopped, the bayou had gone fully dark outside, and the cabin lights were on, and the moths were working the windows. She read back what she had written. It was not perfect. Some of the gaps could not be filled because she did not have the information to fill them. But it was honest, and it was thorough, and it was a record of a man who had refused to let his life disappear into nothing. Written by a woman who had found that refusal in a steel box under a bilge floor, and understood it immediately because she had been making the same refusal her entire life without having the language for it. The thing about the directions our lives are pulled in is that we don't always know where we're going. We can't always explain why we want what we want, or why certain places feel like recognition rather than discovery. But the pull is real, and it is old, and it precedes explanation. And if you are willing to follow it past the point where following it makes obvious sense, past the point where anyone watching would call it reasonable, it usually leads you somewhere. For some people, that somewhere is a place they were prepared for, a path that was laid out in advance with signage and guardrails. For others, it is a place they have to invent or reinvent from materials someone else left behind. May put the notebook back in the drawer. She turned off the cabin light. She lay on the bunk in the dark with the bayou sounds coming through the screens. The frogs returned now that the weather had warmed. The owls, the water against the hull in its patient rhythm, and felt the boat moving under her. Its small continuous adjustments to current and wind. Its negotiation with the water it floated on. She had arrived here with $10 and a coffee can and 2 manila folders full of drawings she had been making since before she could understand why. She had spent one of those dollars on a boat and the other 9 on the first month of a life she had not planned and could not have predicted and would not have traded. The Heron would be back at the shallows at dawn. The bookshelves were full, the hull was sound, the notebook in the drawer was 3/4 full, and she was going to need another one. She was already looking forward to filling it.